Welcome to the 14 industries that built Belfast, where Belfast and Northern Ireland led the world. The success arising from the Industrial Revolution made cities such as in Birmingham, Sheffield, famous all around the world for its steel, Manchester its cotton, Newcastle, South Wales their coal, and Staffordshire its pottery as examples. The great seaports of London, Southampton, Cardiff, Liverpool and Glasgow were as much well known in San Francisco as in Shanghai. With these mighty industries seemingly leading the way, one might believe that the little nondescript town of Belfast had nothing much to contribute to this revolution. But in fact, Northern Ireland, and Belfast in particular, packed a punch as great as any entire region in mainland Britain. Indeed, who could have guessed several centuries ago that this otherwise insignificant little town would one day become as notable as New York or London? And not just for the ill-fated RMS Titanic. To be honest, Belfast, the Gaelic name meaning mouth of the silt, doesn't readily spring to mind as a real powerhouse of industrial might and innovation. But in fact, for Great Britain and her empire, it did actually punch over its weight for centuries before and during two world wars. Around the 16th century, settlers in Belfast found the mouths of the River Lagan and Farset suitable for providing safe harbouring for ships. However, most of the shoreline and the little town itself was mud, a rank mixture of soft clay, silt, loam and peat that became notoriously difficult for any form of building, and had to have deep piles driven in for support. The local name for this nauseous mixture was Belfast Sleech. Nevertheless, right up to this day, much of downtown Belfast still floats on piles driven down into this sleech to as much as 40 metres deep. Flax had been grown in Ireland for centuries, but the linen created from it was far superior to that grown anywhere else, due mainly to the quality of the soil and the many skilled processes it required to make the end product. It was here that Belfast began to lead with the world's finest linen, and still does. It is claimed that there are up to 17 and more different processes needed to get flax up to a weaving product. These include harvesting, drying, bleaching, rippling, retting, scutching, hackling and washing, etc., a highly labour-intensive and skilled business. Following his apprenticeship with the Bryce Smith Linen Weaving Company in 1845, young Thomas Ferguson set up his own company in the town of Banbridge, County Down. The business continues to this day in a collaborative arrangement with Franklin Industries and John England. The quality of Irish linen was so superior that in the early 13th century Henry III banned imports of it to England because it was having a negative effect on English linen weavers, thus substantially cutting his local tax revenues. Nowadays, flax is imported from France, Denmark and the Netherlands, but to retain the high-quality name of Irish linen, all weaving is still done in Northern Ireland, mostly by the famous Ferguson Company. Such was the impact of the linen industry that Belfast soon became known as Linenopolis. Where City Hall now stands was once the headquarters site of the Linen Quarter, which covered much of the area directly behind it. See dark red area above. The picture above right shows one of the many weaving works that are still standing, although now as office buildings for different businesses. As can be seen from this map of the early 1800s, the sleeches, mudflats coloured yellow, covered almost all of the harbour areas, which over the next century had to be reinforced for building in part and dug out for boat building in others. Today, Many of the old retaining walls can still be seen throughout all of the older areas, doing the job perfectly, a tribute to the men who built them. How many and how long the first little boatyards survived is largely guesswork, for with the advent of larger ships coming into being, these little yards were either lost or absorbed into new companies with more famous names, such as McIlwain and McCall, Workman Clark, and a later arrival around 1871 called Harland & Wolff. The map that follows shows their locations in 1909. Here we can see that Workman and Clark operated on both sides of the Victoria Channel, while the new boys, Harland & Wolff, shared space with Workman Clark on the southern side, shown in orange hatching, which became better known as Queen's Island. This early drawing shows how the boatyard looked in 1816. It is located on the northern side of the harbour, with Cave Hill in the background to the right of centre. By 1880, Harland & Wolff had taken over shipbuilding completely. From their original site of 1.5 acres, it had grown to 81 acres by around 1908, which also included 2 giant slipways, marked 1 on the map. The Thompson engraving dock, number 2 on the map. This latter dug by hand by 2 teams of shift workers over a 2-year period, ready for the new Olympic and Titanic steamers launched in 1910 and 1911 respectively. Note the engraving dock for the Titanic tender Pneumatic, number 3 on the map. Harland & Wolff had now become the largest shipbuilders in the world, with the largest ships ever built, then on its huge 184-acre site. The value of shipping lay in trade, passenger travel and mail delivery across the world. But ships right up to the 21st century required ropes for hawsers, rigging, cargo nets, etc. With this in mind, Harland & Wolff decided to partner a separate existing ropework company to meet the increased worldwide demand, and this became the Belfast Ropework Company, located just a mile away from the shipyard. It's here that my tiny part in Belfast's history comes in, although many years later, in the autumn of 1967. It was an insignificant part in the wider scheme of things, but still one tiny historical moment. As a stopgap job until my vocational career could start, I took a job as a rope layer, something of which I knew absolutely nothing. The wages were okay, but had I known better, I would not have taken the job. After all, who, aged 17, would want to work totally alone in a 40-acre building for 6 nights a week without holidays that virtually extinguished all forms of social life? This artist's impression of the ropework building looks somewhat fanciful, but in fact is a reasonable representation of the actual layout and size, spreading as it did across the dividing road of East Bread Street and the River Connswater. As can be seen in the 1901-23 map, the entire works covered over 40 acres and dominated this area of East Belfast. It is said that the actual ropework walk was 1/4 of a mile long. My calculations make it about 330 yards, but I could be wrong. In any event, even from its first days in 1871, it was the largest ropework company in the world. The arrows, incidentally, show the matching viewpoints. The man on the right is making 3/4-inch hemp rope and working on the exact machine on which I trained for 3 weeks. The picture on the left is an extension of the same machine. The correct number of twine bobbins feed twine through a metal die and thence onto 4 larger bobbins. The bobbins spin when the brake behind the man's leg is released. He, the layer, feeds the end product onto the larger reel to the correct length and weight required, with a steel rod. It was a dangerous process on those old Victorian machines that provided little in the way of protection. One could, and often did, lose a finger or even an arm if not careful. 3 weeks later, I was introduced to a modern electric machine that was cleaner and had good safety elements. I was only the second person trained to use it, designed purely for synthetic rope. This highly skilled work meant learning the correct tension gearing, the proper number of twine bobbins, constantly watching for any that ran out, splicing, removing nuts, and etc. After a further 3 weeks training, I was deemed qualified. The catch was that I had to work night shift entirely on my own in a 40-acre building. My worksheets provided me with the setup requirements for each order. Each bale took around 3 hours without breakdowns. Regular breakages every night often meant 4 hours or more per bale. For several weeks, I had only small orders to produce. I was then informed that I was to be given a very special order. That's when I discovered that it was designed for no less a customer than the new Cunard liner QE2 being built in the John Brown shipyard, Clydebank. Thus, my tiny part in Belfast history. I managed to complete the order in time, but by then I had had enough. I had been a part-time police officer for almost 4 years and had applied to be taken on full-time. At the tail end of 1968, I was accepted for full-time policing and so waved goodbye to the rope works despite being asked to stay on. But in truth, I hated the work and couldn't leave quick enough. Having now covered the 3 largest industries of their kind, and I'm not quite finished with them yet, I now turn to another huge Belfast industry, namely that of tobacco. For many years, the city had at least 4 large companies, mainly WD and H.O. Wills, Carreras, Gallagher's and Murray's, Gallagher's being the biggest independent name outside of Bristol. While tobacco has become synonymous with ill health in recent decades, the fact remains that over the years the company created long-term employment for many thousands of workers, along with putting huge amounts of money into the Northern Ireland economy. A relative latecomer to our story is Shorten Harland, better known simply as Shorts. It was another subsidiary of Harland & Wolff, set up in 1908 as an aircraft manufacturing company alongside the shipyard. Its main claim to fame came from its design and building of the Belfast in 1956-62, a large, heavy, 4-engine turboprop intended primarily for military use. However, its most famous aircraft was the Shorts Skyvan, still used in many countries to this day. The Canadian company Bombardier took it over in 1968, and only a few years ago was bought by an American company, Spirit, where it produces wings for the Airbus A220. Currently, it is Northern Ireland's largest employer. In 1881, Sir Samuel Davidson opened his engineering works in East Belfast, having introduced a revolutionary new fan that he said created a wind like a sirocco. Thus, the Belfast Sirocco Works was born. Davidson certainly became famous for invention, development and manufacture of the first ever air conditioning systems, and the first building to use air conditioning was the Royal Victoria Hospital, Belfast. Eat your heart out, USA. In 1858, a small engineering works was taken over by James Mackey & Co., producing weaving looms for the linen industry. The company operated very successfully until 1978, when it became a joint venture with the Indian government to continue its operations in Belfast under the new name of the Lagan Engineering Co. Between them, these two companies employed thousands of workers over many decades. Belfast's industrial heritage has to include Finley's Soap and Candle Company, formed as far back as 1798. I was privileged in knowing old Mr. Finley, the last of the family, during the mid-1950s. This grand old gentleman was the epitome of the well-to-do, genteel Edwardian gentry. An extremely dapper little man with well-groomed white hair and short white goatee beard, always immaculately dressed in a short camel hair coat, dark grey trousers and highly polished black shoes. Likely as not, he might have regarded himself as undressed, without his black ebony walking cane topped with a silver head. It was his habit of stopping to doff his hat at every lady he passed. But for children such as myself, he always asked us to hold out our grubby upturned hands, whereupon he usually teased us a little before dropping one or two mint imperials into them. A genuine, harmless gesture in those days, but clearly and sadly unacceptable in today's PC society. Mr. Finley lived only 100 yards from our house, but in a very grand listed building. I learnt many years later that developers had bulldozed the house to make way for other housing. I don't know the true story, but it seems that once the property was demolished, it didn't make any difference whether or not it was a listed building. Once it's down, it can't be restored. The photo above shows the very busy works in Victoria Square, where it remained until its closure. In its 150-year history, the company employed thousands of workers during 2 world wars. Finley's remained a family business all throughout its lifetime, finally closing its doors in 1949, probably because the Mr. Finley I knew was the last of his family. While there were several other smaller soap manufacturers in the city, Finley's was the largest in the whole of Ireland and amongst the largest in the UK. Although Finley's has largely been forgotten as a major contributor to Belfast's economy, what is even less known is that at the outbreak of the First World War, the company was awarded a government contract to produce both candles and soap for the British and later American forces heading off to war. Several years ago, archaeologists working in Thiepval Wood on the Somme, the location of the 36th Ulster Division in 1916, unearthed a small Finley's tin of soap imprinted with the company name. These little personal soap issues were certainly well known to British soldiers and are now very rare. Much more importantly, they affirm another relevant part of Belfast's glowing heritage. John Dumville was a tea and spirit merchant who founded his own distillery company in Belfast in 1808. He changed his surname to Dunville and began producing his own brand of whisky in 1837. Although the brand did very well, the board of directors chose to liquidate in 1936, whilst still in profit. In 2021, another local distillery, Ekenvale, revived the brand, and so it continues to this day. Dunville's great-grandson won the VC during World War I, and his name is on the Hollywood War Memorial. The Dunville estate is freely open to the public. The oldest licensed whisky distillery in the world has never ceased production since granted its license in 1608, its name taken from the little town of Bush Mills in County Antrim. Just mention Black Bush to anyone in Northern Ireland and they'll know exactly what you mean. for its single blend smooth malt whisky is as popular in the USA as it is in Belfast. With Belfast the heart of the linen industry, it's not surprising that Scotsman William Barber set up his linen thread factory only a few miles away on the outskirts of Lisburn in 1784. The quality of his threads was so high that they were used by bookbinders, museums, leather goods and other fine fabrics all around the world, still in demand today. Initially, using water as its power source drawn from the River Lagan that flowed into Belfast Harbour, the mill at Hildon became the largest manufacturer of linen thread in the world by the end of the 19th century. At the outbreak of the First World War, some 2,000 workers were employed here, and during the Second World War, its threads were being used for military uniforms, parachutes, boots and other military kit. Although several companies merged with Barber in 1898 to form the Linen Thread Company Limited, the quality never changed. Sadly, however, times changed and the mill was closed in 2006, its last 85 workers paid off. Today it lies abandoned and derelict, one more victim of progress. The business was taken over by Vayella Coats and Tutal in the 1990s, but still produced specialist threads under the Barber name. Last, but certainly not the least of Northern Ireland's great industry, is the world-famous Martin Baker aircraft ejector seat, invented and perfected by James Martin from Crossgar, County Down. Martin was a self-taught engineer, inventor and draftsman who, virtually penniless, opened his own engineering works in 1929. 5 years later, in partnership with RAF flying instructor Captain Valentine Baker, they formed the successful Martin Baker Aircraft Company. Sadly, Baker was killed when his aircraft crashed while attempting to land. From this point on, Martin turned his entire focus into producing the life-saving ejector seat, and in 1944 the Air Ministry asked him to develop such a seat for the up-and-coming jet aircraft age. Today, the Martin Baker Company continues as a family business with branches in the US and Australia, and recognised as the foremost leader in aircraft ejection systems, with more than 90 countries using the Martin Baker brand, a brand that is known to have saved more than 6,900 lives. No mean record for a small Northern Ireland industry. Here we have a location and close-up of the Langford Lodge site of Martin's test track that runs alongside the entire length of the main runway. Martin chose the former USAAF air maintenance base at Langford Lodge for his test track. With his very precise specifications, the track did not vary more than 1/16 of an inch in its entire 2,000 yards. Below, I have used only a half section of its full length. It is a sad fact that British industry has suffered greatly over the last 30 or 40 years. Cheaper competition and buyouts from Asia, USA and Europe has decimated our shipbuilding, ropeworks, linen and aircraft industries, just as much as lack of proper home-based government investment. Ownership of many of our great companies has gone to many of these foreign conglomerate giants, they who receive the funding to invest and reap the gains. Once a powerhouse of the world with its mills and factories, innovation, inventiveness, technology and design, Belfast and Northern Ireland in general is now the poor man of the UK in having everything being given away to the highest bidders, notably the USA and China. But let us take a look at what gave one or two of our individual companies extra credit for which they have largely been forgotten. Harland and Wolff, famous for the RMS Olympic, RMS Titanic, HMHS Britannic, HMS Belfast, Southern Cross, Canberra, RMS Pendennis Castle. It was also the first ever yard to successfully launch a deep-sea oil platform, Seaquest, and the SOU Lydia, then the largest oil tanker. During the First World War, they built mostly monitors and cruisers for the Royal Navy, including the light cruiser HMS Glorious. In the Second World War, it built 6 aircraft carriers, 130 other naval ships, and repaired more than 22,000 other vessels, including the Ark Royal. In fact, when the Germans bombed the yard during the Blitz, it caused a lot of damage, but totally missed the Ark Royal. At this time, at its peak, Harland and Wolff employed over 35,000 workers, many of whom were geared to producing hundreds of Matilda, Churchill and Centaur tanks, along with other armoured vehicles and munitions. Belfast Rope Works and Irish Linen. In both peacetime and in 2 world wars, the range of material produced by these two great industries is staggering. Along with linen that graced ordinary households, the finest hotels worldwide, and shipping lines such as Cunard and White Star, Irish linen became the only fabric used in all British wartime fabric-covered aircraft in both world wars, and also as a base for high-quality canvas for tenting and general protective vehicle coverings, parachute rigs, canvas sheeting and much more. Often working in tandem, the ropework was engaged in producing military and naval scrambling and camouflage nets, heavy-duty hawsers, climbing ropes, packaging twine, rigging, matting, infantry webbing, vehicle ties and so on. Short and Holland. While Short was probably best known for its Belfast transporter and Skyvan aircraft in the 1960s, it was during World War II most active in building the famous Sunderland flying boat and Sterling bombers. Besides those, it was the major base for building, receiving and repairing a variety of US military aircraft arriving at Belfast Harbour as part of the Allied war effort. Thousands of British and American aircraft passed through Short's factory during those war years. Just before we close, 2 Belfast industries that are known worldwide, but not necessarily thought of as being associated with the city, are those of John Dunlop and Harry Ferguson. John Dunlop, a Belfast Scotsman, earned fame as the inventor of the first pneumatic tyre. His tyre company was located just across the road from what is now Belfast City Hall. Dunlop tyres are still manufactured today and known all over the world. From Dromore, County Down, Harry Ferguson invented the tractor and tri-linkage system for tractors that today are still being produced by other famous companies. Ferguson also joined forces to produce Ford Ferguson and Massey Ferguson tractors. His early company was in May Street, only 150 yards away from John Dunlop's workshop. In this presentation, I could have mentioned other firsts, although not considered as industries, such as Derry-born Sir James Murray, who in 1809 invented magnesia fluid in Belfast. The Americans like to claim that it was Charles Henry Phillips, an Englishman working at Stamford, Connecticut, but in fact Phillips took out his own patent and renamed it as milk of magnesia in 1885, 76 years after Murray's invention. Or Belfast Lord Kelvin, who in 1848 discovered the idea of absolute zero, the point at which the atoms in an object stop moving entirely, and so can't get any colder. The International Temperature System still bears his name, for example 0 degrees Kelvin. Or the United States Rangers, born during World War II in Carrickfergus, just a few miles north of Belfast, although not so much an invention as a creation, but still a historical creation in and from Northern Ireland. So, if you ever thought that Northern Ireland played little to no part in the UK's industrial history, think again, for this presentation has shown that it was indeed a powerhouse in its own right.